Okay, we're going to start talking about the spinal region in Chapter 13, and we'll begin with talking about the anatomy of the spinal region. So, in the reading, there are some sections in the book that I have specifically excluded. We're not going to talk about them. You're not going to be tested on them. In neuro rehab class next quarter, you will talk more about spinal cord injuries, and so there's a lot of information in this chapter about spinal cord injuries, and you will get a little of that here and then more of it in neuro rehab. So in the book there's some really nice cadaver anatomy pictures, and this one shows the posterior part of the cervical spinal region, and they've removed the vertebral arches, so they've cut through the lamina. You can see where the transverse processes would be, and the spinous process has been removed, and part of the dura mater and the arachnoid have been reflected. So that's this sort of connective tissue part right over here, and that's part of the meninges. So you can see the nerve roots, the rootlets they call them, of the spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord, which is kind of neat, and the dorsal root ganglia and the spinal cord itself. The vertebral artery, we know in the cervical spine we have those transverse foramina, and the vertebral artery runs through those. Okay, so the spinal cord itself, is contained within the spinal cord. The only part of the spinal cord segments that line up exactly with the vertebra that goes with them are in the cervical spine. Once you get a little bit lower, the spinal cord segments are a little bit higher than their individual vertebra. So the nerve roots that come out from between the intervertebral foramina in the cervical spine, they come out above their individual vertebra until you get to the C8 nerve root, because we know there's no C8 vertebra, just C1 through C7. So the C8 nerve root comes out between T1 and C7, and then all of the nerve roots lower than that come out below their individual vertebra. Okay? So the spinal cord itself is actually shorter than the vertebral column, and the nerve roots below L2 all compose part of the cauda equina, or horse's tail, which is that the terminal nerves at the end of the spinal cord that reach down. So this is a picture. There's another anatomy picture of the cauda equina, and showing how the nerve roots are coming out, and how the cauda equina itself relates to the vertebral column. So it's just kind of interesting looking at the layout of it. The spinal cord itself, we talk about it being arranged segmentally. So each segment has a dorsal root and a ventral root. We know from previous chapters the ventral root is composed of motor axons, the dorsal root is composed of sensory fibers, and those two nerve roots unite at the intervertebral foramen and they form the spinal nerve. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that arise from the spinal cord, and there are two spinal nerve roots, one on each side. And each spinal nerve carries motor and sensory fibers, and the axons are from that single spinal segment. So each region of the spinal cord is connected to a specific region of the body through axons traveling through that pair of spinal nerves. And the segments are identified by their corresponding spinal nerves. So like the L4 segment refers to the section of the cord whose spinal nerve traverses the L4 intervertebral foramen, goes underneath L4. So the little diagram, it shows the C6 and C7 segments. C6 goes out and innervates the thumb and the thenar muscles, and C7 goes out and innervates the second and third finger. So it's the dermatomes coming through the dorsal root and the motor fibers coming through the ventral root. So there's a little diagram of the dorsal root ganglion, or what they call the dorsal root entry zone, and it just shows some of those nerve fibers that we talked about in Chapter 6, the muscle spindle 1As and the A betas, A deltas, and Cs, and how they're going into the dorsal root ganglion. So the dorsal rami of the spinal nerves are directed posteriorly, and they innervate the skin and extensor muscles of the neck and trunk. That's the beginning of the peripheral nervous system, like we talked about in the last chapter. The ventral rami contain nerve fibers that become part of the plexes, except those in the thoracic region, and this is the beginning of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so the nerve plexes, we talked about this in the peripheral nerve chapter. They form the network of peripheral nerves, and the peripheral nerves themselves contain fibers from at least 2, and in some cases as many as 5 spinal segments. So we talk about that. We say like the obturator nerve comes from several lumbar segments. It makes sense. If you have an injury in one spinal segment, you have innervation from other spinal segments that can sort of take up the slack, so you don't lose complete function in that nerve. So in the spinal cord itself, we've seen this cross section before, probably way back in Chapter 1 or 2. The dorsal horn is the posterior section of the gray matter that processes sensory information. The lateral horn, which in this drawing that it's not real big, the lateral horn processes autonomic information, and the ventral or anterior horn processes motor information. So in this diagram, the everything in blue is sensory information, and everything in red is motor information. So sensory tracts and motor tracts. So you can sort of start to visualize if you were to have a partial spinal cord injury that affected the dorsal part, you would probably have more sensory effects and fewer motor. If you had something that affected the anterior side, you would probably have more motor and fewer sensory. And then, of course, a complete spinal cord injury, you're going to have motor and sensory issues. So a lot of the gray matter, the sort of the H in the cross section, is composed of spinal interneurons. So the cells, they have their somas in the gray matter, and they act on other cells within the spinal cord. So a lot of the spinal interneurons remain entirely within the gray matter, and their axons travel, their cell bodies are in the gray matter, and there are some whose axons travel in the white matter to different levels of the cord. So you might have a really small spinal interneuron that is just fully within the gray matter because it's going a short distance. It doesn't need to be myelinated because it's such a short distance. And then some with those longer axons traveling in the white matter to different levels of the spinal cord. So I don't expect you to memorize this, but just sort of have a general idea. The anterior part of the cord has a lot of motor stuff. The posterior has a lot of sensory. So it kind of makes sense. So there are some videos if you'd like to watch them on spinal cord anatomy. They're certainly optional, but sometimes having a little video can be really helpful. So we'll same thing, that same diagrams in the PowerPoint. Talking about the ventral and dorsal roots. In that first cadaver anatomy picture, they talked about the rootlets. And rootlets are small groups of axons that are sending information to the periphery. The ventral root is all the ventral rootlets coming together. And the dorsal root is sensory axons bringing information into the spinal cord. And it enters via those rootlets. Okay. This is that same organization of the dorsal root entry zone. It's just kind of interesting to tie together all the stuff that we've talked about before. So the segmental organization I talked about, it's a significant feature of the spinal cord. Each segment of the cord is connected to a specific region of the body, traveling through that pair of spinal nerves. And The connections of those nerve rootlets to the exterior of the cord indicate the segments. Okay, so this is that C6, C7 traveling to the specific part of the body. Spinal nerves carry all the motory and sensory information of a single spinal segment. In the cervical region, the spinal nerves are found above the corresponding vertebra, except the 8th, because there is no C8, and the rest of it, the nerves lie below the corresponding vertebra. Okay, just to review what we just said. So there's this neat little chart of what muscles are innervated by the nerve roots, by the different spinal nerves. And, I certainly don't expect you to memorize this, but just to sort of be familiar with it. And, in green, it shows the cervical spinal nerves, and you can see that's all of the upper extremities. In blue, it's the thoracic, and that's the trunk. And in pink and purple, it's the lumbar and sacral, and that is the lower extremity. So it just kind of gives you an idea of the organization. And it makes sense. Upper part of the cord handles the upper body, lower part of the cord handles the lower body. It's pretty simple, hopefully. So the dorsal horn, we looked at that picture, dorsal horn processes the sensory information, the lateral horn processes the autonomic information, and the ventral horn processes the motor information. And a lot of the gray matter is composed of those spinal interneurons. So this is the H, the gray matter of the spinal cord, and this is in the lower thoracic area. I don't expect you to know all these details of these little layers, the substantia gelatinosa and all that, but it's just gives you an idea. The dorsal horn, that's that sensory information, the blue part. The red part on the side is the lateral horn, that's the autonomic information, and the green part at the bottom is the ventral horn, and that's the motor information. Okay, simple. I don't want the details, just simple. So the meninges are the layers of connective tissue that surround the spinal cord and the brain. But we're just talking about the spinal cord right now. And so the meninges of the spinal cord are continuous with the meninges surrounding the brain, and the layers are named exactly the same. The pia mater closely adheres to the spinal cord surface. The arachnoid is separated from the pia by cerebral spinal fluid in the subarachnoid space, and the dura is the tough outer layer. So you can think dura, durable, it's the tough shell, sort of. It's not really a shell, but you can think of it, it's the tough outer layer that's protecting the spinal cord. So important stuff. So when we move, of course, the spinal cord has to move too. When we, like the example given here, the hip flexion produces anterior movement of the cauda equina and stretches the lumbosacral roots. So in people with normal vertebral canals, moving doesn't significantly change the canal space. If people that have stenosis or some other type of vertebral canal compromise, certain motions can probably change their vertebral canal space and cause some problems. Extending or lateral bending of the neck increases pressure at the intervertebral vertebral foramen at all cervical levels. And that makes sense. The cervical spine is more mobile than other parts of the spine, has less muscular support, and so you're increasing pressure at those intervertebral foramen. Neck extension increases cervical nerve root signs and symptoms. So just different in the neck is far more susceptible to issues with moving than any other part of the spine. So the spinal interneurons, you get afferent and efferent information converging on the same spinal interneurons, and the reflex and voluntary control act together to produce goal-oriented movements. So they talk about reflexes not being hardwired but depend on the environmental context and the task. So there's a lot of interaction. Those spinal interneurons get tons and tons and tons of input, And when we were talking, way back in chapter 2 about temporal and spatial summation, it's not like each neuron is getting 5 inputs and you add them all up. It's getting hundreds of thousands of inputs. So there's tons of information coming in, and the spinal interneurons are sort of sorting all that information. So it's really kind of amazing. So talking about reflexes, the spinal reflexes all involve those interneurons. So, they talk about afferent information from skin or muscles and joints can elicit withdrawal movements. So it's the whole, you get sensory information that your hand is in the fire, and you withdraw your hand from the fire. And a lot of that happens in the spinal interneurons. But you're consciously aware of it too, so there's some voluntary control as well. So they talk about a local sign, a specificity of the movement pattern, meaning that the response depends on the site of stimulation. So if you feel the stimulation in your hand, you're going to move your arm to withdraw from it. So if you feel it in your foot, you're not going to move your arm to withdraw from it. I mean, it's sort of it's really just a simple idea, is wherever you feel the stimulation, that's where you're going to get the withdrawal reaction. So a lot of times the muscles that are removing the part from the stimulation aren't innervated by the same cord segment that received the information. And so it has to be relayed to other cord segments by the interneurons. So the interneurons are hanging out in that gray matter and a little bit in the white matter, and they're sending information back and forth to make things happen, basically. They're processing those reflexes. So it's kind of interesting. So there's a little bit of talk about inhibitory circuits, and I'm just going to bring it up because we talked briefly in the motor chapter about reciprocal inhibition. There is another type of inhibition called recurrent inhibition, which in some sources you'll see it called autogenic inhibition. So there are interneurons and inhibitory circuits that contribute to these phenomena, and the reciprocal inhibition is just like we talked about in chapter 10. It's decreased activity in the antagonist when an agonist muscle is active, and that allows the agonist to act unopposed. So when the agonists are voluntarily recruited, so like you contract your biceps, concentric contraction of the biceps, and the reciprocal inhibition interneurons prevent unwanted activity in the triceps, in the antagonist. So same principle, we're just reviewing it. It's a review. So the reciprocal inhibition phenomena is what separates muscles into agonists and antagonists. So the agonist is the prime mover, and the antagonist is the opposing muscle. Okay. The recurrent inhibition, it's sort of opposite to reciprocal inhibition. It inhibits agonists and synergists, and it disinhibits the antagonists. So it's the phenomenon where you do a brief isometric contraction of a muscle and then you stretch it. There's some slight inhibition after that brief contraction. Okay, so that is all we're going to talk about that. It's not, it's just the opposite of reciprocal inhibition. So reciprocal inhibition, the antagonist is inhibited. Recurrent inhibition, the agonist is inhibited. So there's talk in the book about Renshaw cells, which are the interneurons that produce that. We're not really going to go into that. It's just the information is there for you if you want it. You really do not need to know at this point information about Renshaw cells. So we're going to wrap this up, and then we're going to start talking about dysfunction and lesions. And that's where it gets really interesting.